The metal tray clattered against the stainless steel railing, a sharp, discordant note in the low hum of the crowded mess hall. Dozens of conversations, the clinking of utensils and the shuffle of boots on the linoleum floor created a white noise that was the background of every Marine's day. For Lance Corporal Marcus Thorne, that noise was suddenly drowned out by a single, overwhelming feeling: irritation. He was exhausted. His unit, Charlie Company, had just finished a grueling 16-hour live fire exercise in the choking humidity of Okinawa, and every muscle in his body screamed for rest and food. All he wanted was to grab his tray, pile it with the anonymous protein and carbohydrates that passed for dinner, and find a quiet corner to refuel. The serving line moved with the usual sluggishness. Marcus jabbed his spoon into a vat of mashed potatoes, his movements mechanical. He could feel the grit of gunpowder still clinging to his skin, the phantom ache of his Kevlar helmet's pressure points. His mind was already in his bunk, replaying the day's maneuvers, cataloging his mistakes. He was a good Marine, dedicated and reliable, but today had been a grind. His patience was a frayed rope, and it was about to snap. He turned from the line, his tray heavy, and scanned the sea of green utility uniforms for an empty seat. The long, communal tables were packed with men from different platoons, their laughter and banter grating on his raw nerves. He spotted a sliver of space at the far end of a table near the exit. Perfect. A quick, unobtrusive exit strategy. He began to weave through the crowd, his focus narrowed to that single point. A young Marine, a private first class whose name Marcus didn't know, was moving in the opposite direction. He was slight of build, with a fresh-faced look that screamed, "New boot!" In his hands he carried a tray piled high with food, a wobbly tower of sustenance. As they passed, their shoulders brushed. It was a minor collision, the kind that happened a dozen times a day. But the young PFC, perhaps trying to steady his precarious load, took a half-step back. His elbow connected squarely with the edge of Marcus's tray. The result was instantaneous and disastrous. Marcus's tray tilted, and his carton of chocolate milk, a small, coveted luxury, slid off and hit the floor with a soft thud, its contents exploding in a brown puddle that splattered across the toes of Marcus's already dusty combat boots. For a moment, there was silence. The young PFC looked down at the mess, then up at Marcus, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and immediate gut-wrenching fear. I'm so sorry, Lance Corporal," he stammered, his voice tight. "It was an accident. I didn't mean to—" The apology was like gasoline on the low-burning embers of Marcus's exhaustion. All the frustration, the fatigue, the pent-up stress of the day coalesced into a single hot point of rage. It wasn't about the milk. It was about everything. It was about the relentless pressure, the lack of sleep, the constant demand to be perfect. And this kid, this clumsy, wide-eyed boot, was the unwitting target. "Watch where the hell you're going," Marcus snapped, his voice a low, venomous growl that cut through the ambient noise. A few heads nearby turned. He took a deliberate step forward, using his height and the hard-earned authority of his rank to loom over the younger man. The PFC flinched, his knuckles turning white as he gripped his tray. "You think this is a goddamn playground? You get in that chow line with your head out of your ass." The words were a verbal shove, harsh and unnecessary. The PFC's face flushed a deep crimson. He opened his mouth to speak again, to offer another apology, but no words came out. He just stood there, a statue of humiliation, holding his tray while the chocolate milk spread at his feet. Something in the young man's eyes, a glistening of moisture that was quickly blinked away, should have been a warning. It should have been a splash of cold water on Marcus's anger, but he was too far gone. He saw the look as weakness, as confirmation of the kid's unsuitability. With a final dismissive glare, Marcus reached out and gave the PFC's shoulder a sharp, one-handed shove. It wasn't a full-force attack, but it was enough. The young man stumbled back, his tray wobbling violently. He managed to keep his balance, but the act was complete. The message was sent. In front of dozens of his peers, he had been publicly dressed down and physically pushed by a senior Marine. Satisfied in the most pathetic way, Marcus didn't look back. He found a new spot at a table, sat down, and began to eat his now cold food, his jaw tight. The brief catharsis was already fading, replaced by a faint, sour taste in his mouth that had nothing to do with the food. He told himself the kid needed to learn. He told himself that was how the Corps worked. But the image of the young Marine's face, the stricken, embarrassed look, was stubbornly lodged in his mind, refusing to be dismissed. 20 minutes later, his tray scraped clean and his stomach full, the sharp edge of his anger had dulled into a general sense of unease. He was heading back to the barracks when he saw Staff Sergeant Miller, his platoon sergeant, standing by the bulletin board outside the company office. Miller was a grizzled veteran of 2 combat tours, a man whose quiet demeanor commanded more respect than any shouting NCO. He was reading a notice, his face an unreadable mask. As Marcus approached, Miller looked up. His eyes, usually calm, held a look that made Marcus's stomach clench. It was a look of profound, weary disappointment. "Thorne," Miller said, his voice level. "Get over here." Marcus walked over, his heart beginning a slow, heavy thud against his ribs. "Staff Sergeant." Miller didn't point at the bulletin board, he just gestured with his chin. "Read it." Marcus's eyes scanned the typed page. It was a unit-wide notification, the kind that was all too common. His eyes snagged on a name: Private First Class Elias Vance. The notification stated that PFC Vance had been relieved from duty and was being transported to the Naval Hospital for evaluation. He had suffered a severe anxiety attack following a field exercise and was exhibiting symptoms of acute emotional distress. The notice, in its sterile official language, urged all hands to be aware of the signs of stress and to utilize available support resources. The name meant nothing to him. He didn't know a PFC Vance. He looked back at Miller, a question in his eyes. I don't know him, Staff Sergeant." Miller held his gaze for a long, uncomfortable moment. "He's new. Associated to 3rd Platoon. About 5'8", skinny kid. Fresh out of SOI." He paused, letting the description sink in. "He was just in the mess hall, Thorne, about half an hour ago. Came back to the barracks, sat on his rack, and completely shut down. Couldn't breathe, couldn't talk, just broke." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The mess hall, the kid, the shoulder brush, the spilled milk, the shove, the face, that young, terrified face, flashed before Marcus's eyes with brutal clarity. The blood drained from his own face, leaving him cold. That was him. That was PFC Elias Vance. Miller saw the recognition dawn, saw the horror flood into his Lance Corporal's eyes. He didn't need a confession. He knew. "He was already on the edge, Thorne," Miller said quietly, his voice devoid of anger, filled instead with a sorrow that was far worse. "They all are, those new ones. They're scared, they're overwhelmed, they're trying to find their footing in a world that wants to chew them up and spit them out. And sometimes, all it takes is one more thing. One more push." He emphasized the last word, and Marcus felt it like a physical blow. Marcus opened his mouth, but no words came. What could he say? That it was an accident? That he was tired? That the kid was clumsy? The excuses crumbled to ash on his tongue. He had been the final, crushing weight. He was the one who had pushed a drowning man under for the last time. He stood there, rooted to the spot, as Staff Sergeant Miller turned and walked away, leaving him alone with the terrible, dawning realization of his deadly error. The hum of the camp continued around him, but for Lance Corporal Marcus Thorne, the world had just gone silent. The night was the longest of Marcus Thorne's life. He lay in his bunk, staring at the underside of the rack above him, the cheap springs a meaningless pattern in the darkness. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw PFC Vance's face. Not the humiliated face from the mess hall, but a new, imagined face. A pale, vacant stare, the look of a mind that had simply shut down to survive. He replayed the incident 100 times, 1,000 times. The brush of the shoulder, the spilled milk, the look in the kid's eyes. He saw his own hand reaching out, delivering that final unnecessary shove. It felt like a movie he was forced to watch on an endless loop, the protagonist a stranger he was disgusted to recognize as himself. He didn't sleep. At first light, he was up, moving with a mechanical purpose. He skipped breakfast, the thought of the mess hall making his stomach churn. He went straight to the company office and found the duty roster, then tracked down PFC Vance's platoon sergeant, a man named Gonzalez. Sergeant Gonzalez was a stocky, no-nonsense Marine. But when Marcus asked about Vance, his expression softened into one of tired concern. "He's at the hospital," Gonzalez said, his voice low. "They're keeping him for observation. Sedated, last I heard. His rackmate said he just crumbled. Couldn't stop shaking, couldn't catch his breath. Said something about the mess hall, but he wasn't making much sense." He looked at Marcus, a question in his eyes. "You know something about it?" The lie was right there, ready to be told. "No, Sergeant. Just heard the name. Wanted to see if he was okay." It would have been so easy, but the words wouldn't come. The weight in his chest was too heavy. He just shook his head, a non-answer, and walked away, feeling Gonzalez's curious gaze on his back. For 3 days, Marcus existed in a fog. He went to training. He ate when he had to. He spoke only when spoken to. He was a ghost going through the motions. His friends in the squad noticed. "Hey, Thorne, you look like hell," they'd say. "Get some rack time." He'd just nod and offer a weak smile. He couldn't tell them. How could he explain that he was the reason a fellow Marine was lying in a hospital bed? How could he admit that his own uncontrolled anger had been the catalyst for another man's breakdown? The shame was a physical presence, a hot coal lodged in his gut. He finally got permission to go to the hospital. He told his squad leader he had to see the doc about a nagging pain in his knee. It was a flimsy excuse, but it was enough. The naval hospital was clean, sterile, and quiet. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the soft squeak of rubber-soled shoes on the polished floor. He asked at the front desk for PFC Vance's room, his voice barely a whisper. The corpsman behind the desk gave him a long, appraising look before giving him the room number. He found the room at the end of a long corridor. The door was slightly ajar. He stood outside for a full minute, his hand raised to knock, his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. He could hear the low murmur of a television from inside. Finally, he took a deep, shaky breath and pushed the door open. The room was small and sparse. A single bed was against the wall, and in it, propped up against a pile of pillows, sat PFC Elias Vance. He looked even younger than Marcus remembered. His face was pale, and there were dark, bruised-looking circles under his eyes. He was staring at the television, but his gaze was unfocused, as if he wasn't really seeing it. He wore a standard-issue hospital gown, making him look small and vulnerable. When he heard the door, he turned his head slowly. His eyes, when they landed on Marcus, widened in recognition, and then immediately filled with a fresh wave of anxiety. He visibly tensed, his hands gripping the thin blanket. Marcus felt his own throat constrict. He stood in the doorway, a giant, awkward figure in his desert Marpat utilities, filled with a regret so profound it was paralyzing. He didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry" seemed like the most pitifully inadequate words in the English language. "Hey," Marcus finally managed, his voice a hoarse croak. He took a tentative step into the room. I'm Lance Corporal Thorne." Vance just nodded, his eyes wary, watchful. He didn't speak. Marcus moved to the single plastic chair next to the bed and sat down heavily. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together. He couldn't look Vance in the eye. He stared at the floor. I came to say I'm sorry." The words felt clumsy, wooden. "That night in the mess hall, I was a complete ass. It wasn't your fault. It was mine. All of it." Silence. He could feel Vance's gaze on him. He forced himself to look up. The anxiety was still there in the young man.